every once in a while she'll be like, well, I'm worried that you're giving too much. And I'll be like, no, giving is the thing, right? Giving is the thing that fills your heart and that makes life worth living. And I think that there's a universal desire to be giving.
Every single one of us is a leader and could be a leader.
It started with a local coalition in our county.
Strategies you know, but stories you don't.
Data is the currency of prevention.
We want to reduce the negative and we want to promote the positive.
Collaboration is the only way to move the prevention needle.
About connecting the research with the practitioner.
Put something out there that was kind of off the wall and create a community of prevention.
It's a passion, it's a real love to try to help make our world a little bit better, a little bit happier, small pieces at a time.
It's said an overnight success takes 16 years.
If we didn't plan for the change, but if we didn't help orchestrate it, then change is going to be upon us.
When it comes to the spiff, slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. Because the real power is in the process.
Ultimately, all of us want success in the work we're doing. We don't want to do mindless work. Proactive, participatory planning promotes positive, preventive progress.
This is the Mid-America PTTC podcast. I'm your host, Dave Clausen, and I'm the director of the Mid-America Prevention Technology Transfer Center. This is episode 31, and today we're bringing you a special cross-PTTC regional episode. I had the pleasure to listen in on a conversation between Marie Cox, who's the director of the South-Southwest PTTC, and Laura Porter, who is a co-founder of ACE Interphase, LLC. Laura is working with Dr. Robert Anda to help leaders throughout the nation to use the knowledge of neuroscience, epigenetics, ACE research, and resilient communities to dramatically improve population health. In today's episode, they really dive into three main questions. The first being, during this current pandemic time, are the kids going to be okay? And how can we keep creating help that helps? And the third question, well, I can't just give that one away. You'll have to listen and find out. But before we get into the content, we'd like to thank our funder, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And a quick note, although funded by SAMHSA, the content of this recording does not necessarily reflect the views of SAMHSA. And without further ado, let's get into today's episode. All right, and I would like to welcome Marie and Laura to the podcast. Hey, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dave. This is Marie Cox. I'm the director for the South-Southwest Prevention Technology Transfer Center in Region 6. And I am so excited to be here with Laura Porter. Laura, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Laura Porter, and I work with a small business in partnership with Dr. Rob Anda. Our business is called ACE Interphase. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experience, because we help communities work on preventing adverse childhood experience and also work on building stronger community so that all families and individuals can do well.
Awesome. Well, Laura, you and I have worked together for many years, most recently to train some ACE Interphase master trainers for our region. And so when, things started changing rapidly in our lives in early and mid-March, and we really started trying to figure out, we are in the midst of this infectious disease pandemic, and we are, practicing to some degree this sort of social isolation, and a lot of our regular ways of doing things have changed, and we started talking to prevention professionals around the region, and there were really a lot of questions about how do I do this now? What is my purpose? How do I keep going when so many things have changed. And so lots of concern about trauma and about adverse childhood experiences. And so my very first thought was, well, you know what? I would really love to talk to Laura about that. So I think we could have a really meaningful conversation that might help the prevention professionals in our region and really across the field rethink or reframe their purpose in light of our current situation. And so here we are. And we have a couple of lines of inquiry here that I thought we talk about. And so we can sort of get started. What are your thoughts about just this kind of general idea of reframing or repurposing, reframing or refinding our purpose in all of this?
So first, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. I always look forward to it. So thank you for the invitation. I think it is a really exciting time, and we have done a lot of prevention through coalitions and through gatherings and through facilitated processes with large groups of people, and those are not available to us at this time. And yet we know the point of transmission for the kinds of stresses that lead to substance abuse. Those points of transmission are still present, right? In relationship, in homes, in families, in extended networks of people. And so we have this dilemma that the transmission can still be happening, the transmission of the kinds of stressors that lead to substance abuse, but our usual strategies are not available to us. And so I think it's a time for a lot of imagination, for conversations like this, and for deeper thinking about where is the risk? We've been trained to look at lists of risks and protective factors and all of that. But in those lists, it kind of ends up being a fire hose of information that we're trying to navigate. And I think we have some advantage now of really fine-tuning and looking more carefully at where are those vulnerabilities in people's lives that we can touch in a caring way now through virtual, through sharing in neighborhoods in different ways that are not a lot of high contact, and also thinking more carefully about physically, what is the space that those vulnerabilities happen in? If it happens in homes, then how are we reaching into homes? And we tend to skip over that in our excitement about coalitions and big meetings. And, and so I think there's a big opportunity to kind of reflect on what we can see now and what we're learning now.
Yeah, that, as we think about those areas of risk or those points of transmission, the question that keeps coming up is, are the kids going to be okay? Prevention focuses often on youth, young people, and so there's this question: how can we think about serving youth right now? We're worried, they're experiencing trauma, and we can't support them in the ways we had planned through the activities we had planned.
Yeah, and it's ironic because we are worried about the kids, but the kids are most fluent with these virtual environments. And so they're probably more able to find supports and camaraderie and loving care among social networks that go beyond their households than the people that are my age, where we're fumbling around with the technology. I do think that it's important to be thinking in this time and in all time about who kids are in relationship with. And So we do these activities where we pull kids out of relationship with their natural systems, their family and neighborhood, et cetera, systems. And we do these activities, and that builds their efficacy and that builds their skills. And there's fabulous things that we do. But sometimes prevention forgets to really focus in on how are we working with the adults that are interacting moment by moment in children's lives to strengthen that the space, the relational environment that those adults and kids are in. And I got to go last year on a speaking trip to New Zealand. And this was a substance abuse prevention conference, their national conference. And it was Maori Language Week. And there was a Maori language specialist there who was speaking, who had studied all of the Pacifica languages. And she was looking for, you know, where are the hints in language about where we might focus prevention. And one of the things she shared really deeply struck me, and so I want to share it with you. She said that in all the Pacifica ancient languages, there was a word that means the sacred space between us. And in all the Pacifica histories and traditions, there was a dedication to nurturing that sacred space between human beings. And the word is va, V-A. So I like to think about, you know, is prevention focusing in on nurturing that va, or are we simply creating activities that take people away from the va?
Wow.
I think this is a lovely time to be reflecting on that. Can we find ways to help youth to nurture that va and find ways to help adults learn to do it, and find ways to help adults repair, because let's face it, all parents blow it from time to time, and
Yes.
we need some help to repair. And you know, when we're together 24/7, we're probably doing a little bit more of that blowing it once in a while.
Possibly.
Yeah. So I think that it's a wonderful time for that deep thinking, but also just sharing that we're practicing we're practicing that repair, we're practicing nurturing va, and begin to build some language around that. I think kids are usually the first to jump into new language, the first to be willing to explore it, and they're in a lovely stage of life where they're invincible and they're ready to change the world. And if they have these tools, I think they can just do phenomenal healing work right now.
That is really, I like this sort of idea that this is not just practice interrupted, right? It's a possibility to practice new ways of doing things, so that maybe our work with youth in the future, whatever the future looks like, in the short term or the long term, is different or better or more powerful or more effective. So that's really it's a really lovely way of sort of reframing that, I think.
So Marie, I have a question for you that
Yeah.
it's related to this one, and that's when we think about the youth that live in constant turmoil. If they live in a neighborhood where there's racism, or there's the levels of stress on their daily lives are such that this reflection I'm talking about is not really accessible to them. I would suspect that those are the same neighborhoods where it's hard to use some of the typical youth gathering tools, or because you have this this tension, this violence, this experience that causes people to live in the moment and not really see the future, right? Which is one reason that they engage in really dangerous behavior is, why invest in the future? I'm not going to have one.
Right.
And so when we're thinking about that group of kids, I'm just curious about if you've seen creative strategies over the many years you've worked with communities for helping to to relate to that group that's in the moment, that's probably not seeing the pandemic as different. You know, there's danger every moment. Yeah, there's danger every moment.
Yeah. So yeah, so you're talking about for families or communities where you know, fight, flight, freeze is a way to survive, and that it's a
Mhm.
very logical you know, reaction to your environment. You know, I mean, I think in prevention we talk a lot about the answers in the community, right? And so um you know, the question I have in those situations are, you know, how, what are the institutions, who are the people in that community who already know, right? And can we, instead of, you know, sort of being, you know, I'm from prevention and I'm here to help, you know, if we're part of those communities, how can we continue to lift our communities up? And if we're not part of those communities, how can we look for more equitable allocation of resources to those communities from whatever systems we're a part of. I mean, you know, you've worked in many communities, and you talk a lot about some really unique community-specific solutions. And so I'm not sure that it's a matter of, you know, a one size fits all, but more a matter of equitable, increasing the availability of resources, maybe.
Mhm.
I don't know.
For some reason, I flashed on this community that I'm working with, where they've been working with different ways of helping people stay self-regulated, including kids stay self-regulated during this time. And you know, we can use breathing, deep belly breathing, we can use mindfulness, we can use a lot of things. But one of the effective strategies is actually drumming, is rhythm.
Mm.
And so when you have groups of people where there's a lot of fight or flight, there's a lot of danger in the world, if you look historically over many cultures, you see drumming as a ritual ceremonial healing for those times and for those people. And often young people are the drummers. It takes a lot of energy
Right.
to keep the rhythm up. And so one of the communities I'm working with there, they've instituted this idea that inside of households we could be developing our own rhythm inside the household and playing with a particular rhythm, with the idea that all over the community people are doing their own rhythm of drumming. And when we come back out, when we're able to be together, we can have essentially a parade where we're hearing all the rhythms together coming through the neighborhood. It does seem to me that those kind of the physicality of that is helpful to work through a dangerous kind of situation that could lead to people reaching to substance abuse, just because the feeling in your body when you're in danger, you want to get rid of that feeling, right? And drugs and alcohol do that, but they're not the best way, right? So
Right.
like, are we helping people find alternatives and really being direct about this isn't the best way, it's drug alcohol, but there are other ways. We can still be helping our bodies be comfortable in helping ourselves be comfortable in our bodies. So I like that, and I like you know, that in Minnesota there's pictures of people singing on the porches and do this parallel play singing. I think that does some of the same thing. And then I've been reading across in different countries how they're approaching keeping kids safe and building some different policy around that right now. And in Greenland, they have this commitment to reduce child sexual abuse, to end child sexual abuse in a fairly short amount of time. And so the head of the country declared that there wouldn't be any alcohol sales at all in the state, in the national capital, because he was saying that if we're serious about protecting children, then we will interrupt this pipeline towards their danger. And what I liked about it, not only the strategy is really inspiring, but also I liked about it that he didn't duck the issue. You know, he said we're going to reduce the use of substances right now because we're protecting children, right? Because we're committed to ending these risks for our children. And I just think that habit of being transparent, of being clear about why we would do changes to our day-to-day lives that are difficult, I think that transparency is really important for prevention as well.
And that reminds me of something that Dr. Anda said in a training that we were in. You know, people were asking him about building resiliency or building protective factors, and he kind of said, well, that's, you know, that's fine, but why don't, and I'm paraphrasing him, right? But why don't we just stop these bad things happening? You know, we have these 10 adverse childhood experiences. We know that they are, you know, very strongly correlated with very poor outcomes. Why don't we focus on that? You know, and that was really the plainest way, you know, that I had ever heard that. I thought, yeah, you know, that is really a really important check for us as we're thinking about why we're here and what we're doing with young people.
Yeah, and it's easy to be distracted away from true prevention,
Yeah,
right? and get all wrapped up in all the things we could do. And yeah, I think it is really important every once in a while just to strip it all the way down to where do we need to focus so that we actually are preventing these difficult things, including substance abuse. Yeah.
And that really, I mean, that really speaks to this question of we can't, you know, we're really concerned about our activities and the interruption of our activities. So can we go back, you know, and think about what's the true prevention that we're trying to do? What are we really, what's the harm we're really trying to stop? You know, I think that flows very neatly into kind of our second line of inquiry. So moving sort of from thinking about youth to thinking about communities. And again, you know, we want to build these resilient, self-healing communities. And so how do we do that right now? How do we do that? How do we create that help that helps is something that you talk about in communities that may or may not have experienced this kind of community-wide crisis or stress.
Right. Well, we know from research that social emotional support is so important for human beings. That sense of belonging with others, so critical for our sense of safety. And then this notion of having practical help when you need it, when you ask for it, somebody would actually arrive and help you is essential for a strong community. And there's another factor that I think is at the community level, and that's the reciprocity, the habit of giving and receiving into and from community, where we don't necessarily have to know who we're giving to and who we're receiving from, right? We just end up in a healthy community, we end up giving and receiving in ways where the flow of the well-being, right, is alive, and that can generate whole new sources of flow. I have a young friend who's living at my house right now. She's recovering from an injury, and so it's been a real pleasure to have another person here. Otherwise, I'd be living alone. But you know, this issue of how does that flow of reciprocity happen has been really, really wonderful to watch, because every once in a while she'll be like, well, I'm worried that you're giving too much. And I'll be like, no, giving is the thing, right? Giving is the thing that fills your heart. And that makes life worth living. And I think that there's a universal desire to be giving. So I think your question is an important one, because we feel like a lot of the avenues for building self-healing in communities are shut down.
Yeah.
But when I'm in podcasts or whatever venue that I'm working with communities in, sometimes it's just a Zoom meeting, I'll say, what are the surprising resources that are surfacing at this time? And they're all about these things. A woman who decides she's going to brighten the day of the street, and so she drives back and forth with balloons to make people smile, or the people that self-organize meals with a story or a game that goes with the meal, and they drop them off at the corner and everyone can come and get them. Or one community that's set up a whole mechanism for calling every family every week using volunteers who speak the native languages of the families. And just, that's not a call that's about giving service to the family. It's a call to say, how are you doing? It's right? It's a chatting call. And what they've found is that they're not having problem finding people who want to do that. Like, people want to call and ask, how are you doing? So I think when we think about the web of social emotional support, of practical help, of reciprocity, that web might be easier to strengthen now in some ways, because we're not so busy in the same ways, right? Think of all of the commuting time of moms not taking kids to all of the kid appointments. That time has been freed up, right?
Right.
And all the commuting time to work and back, all of that we have as a precious resource right now. And I think it's a lot just our imagination. How do we deploy some of that, or how do we just notice where it's naturally happening, and give it the attention and the story repeating that it deserves? Because I really think that the help that helps is pretty close to heart. It's not such big infrastructure usually. It's more, can we truly notice one another in a deep way? And can we truly appreciate our differences and the reality of one another's lives? And then in that magic moment where we realize, oh, I could give this. That's the magic that helps a community really being a self-healing community, I think, is to open up that space for everyone to be contributing.
And I think that's really, that leads me to this question. So, is a role for prevention professionals right now enhancing that noticing, promoting that awareness of that giving and of that reciprocity, and doing that in a way that it is memorable, and that maybe we change future practice based on that enhanced noticing or realizing or promoting. So
I love that idea.
it's a thought, and it seems, in some way it's like, well, preventionists are really perfectly poised to do that, right?
Yes.
They're in the community, they have those relationships, and maybe do that accidentally or incidentally anyway, but so can we do that purposefully, with a eye toward repetition in mind? Right.
You know this about me, but the people listening to the podcast might not, that I worked for the state of Washington for 17 years, and I was a liaison, a translator, so to speak, between state government and 42 community collaboratives across our state. And one of the habits that we really nurtured in my office was we called them "you won't believe this" stories.
It's great.
And we really purposefully and intentionally collected those stories, which were very easy to collect because there was a lot of really fabulous work happening throughout the state. But we found that when we repeated those stories, there was an energy and an enthusiasm and sort of doubling down on commitment that happened in the prevention world, because they often, prevention is partly a field that focuses on let's not have the dark side emerge in life.
Right.
And so you end up looking at that dark side. But these stories that we're talking about, that you're noticing, you're not ignoring the dark side, right? You're acknowledging that we're going to walk in a way where we don't have to live in that. But what you're repeating and in the story you're telling is the story of the future that you want to live in.
Yeah.
And there's something very powerful about stories about future aspiration, especially when it's common aspiration. Like, we all actually want children to be nurtured and safe. In a few people's worst moments, that might not be what happens, but I think in our hearts we have a common aspiration to want that. And so there are many aspirations like that. If we're noticing for those themes and repeating those stories, I think it can be really powerful prevention.
Yeah. And that's not necessarily the story that we are drawn to as preventionists. We're sort of like, okay, well, what's the overdose rate right now? Or what's the consumption rate right now? And those are important. It's important to have a handle on those stories, but maybe our storytelling needs to be a little more balanced.
Yeah, I think, I learned a big lesson when we orchestrated this process where we trained key leaders from communities across the state how to do a particular kind of interviewing, and we were trying to learn more about why people don't act to protect children. And so we deployed hundreds of key leaders from communities who went and interviewed other key leaders, Rotary, Kiwanis, Seroptimus, that kind of leadership, civic leadership roles. And overwhelmingly what we got back was people just didn't want to make things worse. They didn't actually need to be shocked by the numbers of children that are in trouble with substance use, or the numbers of children that are experiencing maltreatment, or they already knew those things. The thing they didn't know was, what is it that a person does to contribute to a good community?
Yeah.
So that's what those stories help with. It's like it gives you the foundation to actually act in your daily life.
Yeah, and we know that a little bit. Like, we know that, fear-based media messaging is not super effective in changing, youth behavior. So how can we build on that knowledge? How can we tell those stories so that people do know what to do and feel empowered to not make things worse?
Yeah. And I feel like it does help if you have some knowledge of how trauma affects development, because for example, the story that I was talking about, the drumming, if you know that drumming actually helps soothe the amygdala, helps reduce the kinds of stressors that make life more difficult and make people more vulnerable, then you'll repeat that story as opposed to another one that might be wonderful and might fill your heart, but isn't going to be very applicable for the group of people who've experienced a lot of adversity and trauma. So I think also getting fine-tuned in, are we telling stories that help with equity, right? And in this case, I'm talking about equity between the group that's experienced historical trauma or childhood trauma and the group that is not. We want to tell stories where everyone has access to the healing power of community, not just one group or the other.
And that really, the sort of third thing that I was hoping that we would explore was sort of, how do we think more deeply or in a more refined way about how individuals and families with long, possibly intergenerational histories of trauma are experiencing this current crisis that we find ourselves in.
Well, I'm a little bit concerned that there are assumptions that those families are not doing well.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard a lot of reports in the prevention community in particular that family adversity must be way, way up, and it's these families. But I think that one size doesn't fit all here, that for many people who've experienced adversity and trauma and historical trauma, these COVID-19 days are easy.
Yeah,
and,
I mean,
and they have plenty of skills to navigate the kinds of environments that we're having to navigate now. It's the people who haven't experienced adversity maybe are a little overwhelmed with how different their life is. But if you've had a chaotic life in which you have to change at any moment, the fact that your life had to change is normal, right? So we may find as we come back out of this social distancing time that there are large numbers of families that we thought were at risk that actually were at peace, that actually have less stress because of the commute time, the demands on the adults from work and family and bills and home and all of those things, and the lack of time to process those stressors in our usual daily life. Right now we have more time, right? So maybe there's, for some people that, I've talked to parents who've said, I used to really struggle with my emotional regulation. I think I blew it more often than I would want to with my kids. But now that we're all at home together, I'm not finding it as hard to really be the dad I want to be, really be the mom I want to be. And I think it's because we were rushing out the door all the time, and we were always worried about late, and we were not going to fulfill our obligations, and somehow it wasn't going to work, and all of that stress with the schedule and the busyness of life, I think can put people over an edge too. So this idea that because we're home we're more risk, I'm not sure. I think we should be asking these families and letting them share their stories and hearing more from them about what is the help that helps, and also what are they learning, what are they giving, what are they doing with this amazing time of being together with their families.
Yeah. I think it's interesting in the ACEs training that you trained our master trainers to do. There's this diagram, and it sort of shows a point at birth and then two sort of divergent paths. So one path is low levels of adverse childhood experiences, and a focus on a brain focus on people, process, possibilities, and the end result is sort of thriving in the best conditions. And then you have this other path with higher levels of adverse childhood experiences. And the sort of end of that part of the diagram is, challenges in sort of a peaceful world, but thrives in adverse conditions. And so, there are parts of our world right now where we are needing to be more vigilant. We're needing to act quickly and, on impulse. And so I think I'm very fascinated by the idea that families and people who have those skills at the ready have something to teach our communities.
Yeah, it goes to the point that I think is really important, and that is that those developmental experiences create adaptations. I think a lot of people talk about ACEs or trauma, childhood trauma, as if we become broken people. We don't become broken people.
Yeah.
We become whole people who adapted to a particular kind of world, and we bring these glorious strengths along with us, right? And so this issue is, what's the right match, right, with the strengths that we did get to build? And I think you're exactly right. Some of the strengths that you build when you have adversity as a childhood are pretty applicable right now. The ones that you just mentioned, and then being a little bit more oriented towards self, a little bit more protective of self is probably a good idea right now. And that notion of hypervigilance is absolutely critical now. And this, having family leaders, whether it's mom or dad or auntie or uncle or whoever it is who has those characteristics, those are probably the people that are saying, well, I don't know, let's figure out another way. Maybe only one person from the neighborhood needs to go grocery shopping and can distribute across the neighborhood, or maybe there are ways that we could think more creatively about reducing risk. It's probably the people with a little more hypervigilant that are coming up with those solutions. And then those solutions transfer across to self-healing community, right? Because you just need to bump them up one notch from household to community, and you get this flow of surprising partnerships and surprising resources that are so valuable. So my guess is when we come through this, we're going to have this really amazing opportunity to learn from people who probably have higher ACE scores and who are using the strengths that they have to build stronger communities in their own ways. And I think that might be also a prevention role. Are we asking?
Yes. Yeah. That's I'm sorry, I talked over you for a second. Yeah, it, instead of, because I see a lot of, concern or planning. So, when kids go back to school, or when whatever it is, fill in the blank starts up, how can we be there to fix what got broken? To heal what got hurt. But it seems like there's another set of important questions that we as prevention practitioners should be asking, which is, what were the adaptations that were powerful? What were the adaptations that were useful? Can we take those and promote those and learn from them and move forward with those adaptations?
Yeah, and it's a very complex question. And so for the prevention community to pick it up and use it, we need our own internal dialogue, right? To peel that apart and understand it. I think that's where your master trainers are going to be so valuable to help with that, right? For people to understand more about adaptations and to facilitate the kinds of conversations like we're having now, where we're really saying, let's think more deeply, let's peel the layers of the onion back and take a look at what's inside. And we have this opportunity to slow things down enough to do that. I mean, usually the grants require that you're moving fast, do this, do that, do that. And you're supposed to be guaranteeing that you accomplished all of this within certain many months and all of that. And I think there's a little bit of grace right now, maybe, to be saying, well, we couldn't actually do those things we promised, so we did these other things.
Right. Yeah, that kind of reflection is purposeful, has purpose, and can lead us or support movement towards our outcomes. You said something a little bit earlier that I really think is important and want to underscore, which is all of this is sort of predicated upon really understanding the neurobiology of trauma. that I think as a profession, we are all aware that trauma has impact, right? What do those adaptations look like?
Yeah, and I think we as a society, and so the prevention field reflects society in some point, yeah.
Yeah.
We as a society still have this belief that substance problems are about choice. And
Mm,
I think moving past that and, difficulty with substance abuse is also about biology. And so we're preparing kids to make different choices, but are we really helping kids understand their biology deeply enough to know how to manage the sensations in their bodies? And that's, I think, going to be the most powerful thing for preventing substance abuse in this next generation is them getting this keen awareness about what it feels like,
mhm.
both to be pretty dysregulated and to wish you could reach to something that would automatically regulate you, and then
Right?
to pull yourself into a more regulated sense where you can feel safe and more peaceful in your own body. And um, yeah, that's a very different approach to prevention than we're keeping kids busy and we're helping them have skills and we're helping them make better choices and we're helping them have better esteem, and all of that doesn't really touch. But what about, can I live in my body
Right.
given what's happened in my life that's produced these feelings in me? And I think that's the future of prevention, is for us to be able to be more honest with young people about, the generations that came before them didn't know.
Yeah.
So we just had these knee-jerk reactions and we just did the best we could, but we didn't know. And so there's more knowledge now, and this generation has just tremendous opportunity to be using that knowledge if we're sharing it with them.
Well, and that points to our own need for self-awareness for ourselves. I mean, you talk in many trainings, you talk about it's not just about the experiences of the focused population. It's about the experiences of everybody in the community, those who are the providers and those who are the receivers.
Yeah.
And I think that just brings that home even more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for prevention specialists, they're often looking at we're preventing particular kinds of things.
Right.
But this notion of we're looking outside of ourselves almost in a sense of frenzy for something that can help with how to be in our own bodies, that spans a huge wide range of things
Right.
that often we're not totally tied together with everyone addressing all of those issues, but it's the same origin, right? Yeah.
Well, and I mean, I think that this current sort of infectious disease um, related crisis has really brought home how important our health is, right? Across, physical and behavioral health. And so we have, as a field, talked on and off about, you know, primary care and behavioral health and integrating our approaches. Um, but this just underlines, I think, for our field, how important that kind of approach is. And we know from the ACE study that there are both physical and behavioral health consequences. Um,
Mhm.
so I think that is just another source of inspiration to push us to that kind of worldview.
Yeah, COVID's actually giving us some gifts, even though it's not the way we might have chosen to get them.
Right. Yes. Exactly. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
anything else that you would want prevention professionals to be thinking about or learning about or talking about in this current period?
Well, I think that I would want them to be practicing good self-care.
Mm,
It is a stressful time in any profession where we have to change our whole mode of thinking and our mode of operating. And taking time, making sure you get a glass of water, taking time for those really basics, I think is important. And it is also work. Self-care is also work. And I think in the prevention field, often we get so busy we forget that that's true. So that came to mind as you were asking that question.
yeah, no, that sounds relevant.
Yeah.
Very much so. Well, thank you so much for hanging out with us and talking. I always get a great amount of enjoyment out of getting to talk with you. And this may not be the last conversation that we make available to folks. So I would say to anybody listening, look for more information in the future, kind of along these lines.
Thank you, Marie. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks, Laura.
That concludes this episode. Thank you all for not only taking time to listen, but for your continued work making our community safe, healthy, and drug-free. If you'd like to know what trainings we have coming up, check out our website at pttcnetwork.org. There you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter and get the latest, greatest delivered right to your inbox each month. And remember, prevention is better together. And together, we are stronger. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode.